Candles. Why do we light them? Why are they so important in our lives?
And what's the meaning of the Feast of Candlemas, not only for us, but for you who are listening?
How are listeners responding to our Fire and Light podcast?
And how are we going to reflect on Black History Month?
I'm Tessa Bilecki.
And I'm David Denny.
And this is Fire and Light.
Conversations on life, love, and soul.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We wanted to start this episode by sharing with you some of the responses that you listeners out there have been sending us in response to our first podcast. We're so edified by your interest and by your enthusiasm. We told you last time that Fire and Light is named after a course that we taught at Colorado College years ago on the history of the Christian mystics. And so it was so appropriate that our first response came from one of our former CC students who said that the podcast took her back to that class over 20 years ago and made her day. And she took our advice about living a natural life, which was the theme of the last podcasts. And she went out for a walk immediately, and it made her day.
And then the next day, this was really interesting to me. I looked at the New York Times and also in the Atlantic and saw that there were articles about the health effects of awe and of being outside in nature. So that was pretty cool.
It was so-called new science about everyday wonder. And I was just so amused because we have been advocating these natural practices to enhance your contemplative life for decades ourselves. And then here's somebody writing about the scientific benefits of it. So the physical benefits, as you might guess, when we go out for a walk or spend time in nature or experience something that fills us with awe, we reduce our stress, our inflammation is decreased, our breathing deepens.
And then there's the psychological effects and benefits that definitely can quiet down our inner critic. That's one of the things that the scientists are saying. I found fascinating that it kind of short circuits our narcissism and any sense of entitlement we might have. And instead we kind of forget ourselves.
Yeah, because we're in the presence of something that's larger than ourselves. That's what an awe-inspiring experience is. And so we see our rightful place in the order of things, which is a lot smaller place than a lot of us think our place is.
Yes, I think one of the scientists talks about how it's just a sense of vastness that inspires awe. I like that word.
Yeah, vastness. Another response came from Sarah in San Diego, and she really loved our emphasis on interreligious dialogue or interspirituality. And she found that the podcast reflected what religion and spirituality should be, according to her. I loved her choice of words. It was open, kind, curious, inclusive, and accessible to everyone.
We were also pretty thrilled when on the other side of the world in Laos, Paul and Kirsten were listening to our podcast from Laos, where Paul is working as a nurse in a medical clinic. So at a children's hospital. So that was pretty wonderful.
Yeah, listening on their phones.
Yes.
Listening on their phones to the podcast. And several people told us they really like our doing a meditation at the end, but that last time it was too short. So we've taken that into account, and we're going to, from this episode on, we're going to lengthen the meditation.
And one friend said that she really liked how human and ordinary we are, which is exactly what we're hoping.
And she also mentioned liking the length of the podcast, which we're keeping to a certain number of minutes, especially for those of you who are listening to this as you commute to work. We want you to be able to finish and listen to our meditation and go to work in a good place.
We had another really interesting response from an old friend of ours, Suzanne, who said, yes, it's good to go out in nature and know the names of things, but it can also work against you. Sometimes we say, well, that's a maple tree, and we don't really look at it because, well, we know that maple is maple. And what she was suggesting is that we practice unlearning the names of things so that we really pay attention and experience them fresh and new and instead of as a category that we already know.
Yeah, and she's an artist, a contemplative artist, so that makes great sense. That was a very interesting perspective. However, I do want to say that when I was recommending knowing the names, I wasn't meaning it in a scientific sense where you get distracted by categories and labels and judgments and put things in boxes. I was talking about knowing the names the way a friend knows the name of a friend, the way the lover knows the name of the beloved, which is quite a different thing than scientific categorizing.
Yeah, it's a difference between a driver's license and a love letter.
This is February. This is the month of a great feast in our Roman Catholic tradition called the Presentation. And this is a pretty important feast day for you. How come?
Well, let's see. It would have been about 1975. I arrived in the monastery around the time of the Feast of Candlemas. And it's another feast of light. It's an epiphany. And what I love about it is it focuses on Mary, the mother of Jesus, as a woman who is not just ethereal. Sometimes I think in European spirituality, this idea of Mary as, I don't know,
Mystical rose.
Yeah, mystical rose and very otherworldly. Whereas my image of Mary was more like a woman who's making tortillas in the kitchen.
Living in the Southwest, you're so devoted to Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Exactly.
And that's the image that you love.
Yeah. So I kind of fell in love with this image of Our Lady as, Carole King has that song "Natural Woman," and probably most people don't think of that as Mary, but I do.
And so you've written a post on sandandsky.org for this season, and I love the graphic that you created for this. Say a little something about that graphic because it's very mysterious. Also love how you do it in black and white, which is kind of a refreshing change from all the color.
Yeah, I took a photograph of, actually, it's an image of Mary at your house, and it's a terracotta Mexican image, which has 2 candle holders in it. So it's an image of her with lit candles, but it's in black and white.
Yeah, and because it's terracotta and because you did this kind of mysterious thing with the photograph, you posterized it, you get that sense of a rough-hewn Mary and her earthiness.
Yeah, and I think that February for a lot of people is a pretty dark month, and weather can be terrible, and so this sense of candlelight in the midst of the darkness is wonderful to me.
Yeah. Which brings me to the post I did for this month celebrating Candlemas. Now, what is it about candles? Why do we light so many of them in our lives on so many different occasions? We put them on birthday cakes. We light them during sicknesses and illnesses. My mother here's how I learned first about the importance of candles. My mother made an altar in, of all places, on top of the refrigerator in our kitchen. And in another podcast, we'll talk about the importance of making altars. This is a very important spiritual practice. My mother just did it naturally and spontaneously. So she put a statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus up there. Could be any sacred statue, Krishna, Kuan Yin. And she also put up, it was a very bad piece of art, but the meaning was really significant for me as a kid. It was a Madonna of the kitchen. It was Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she was wearing an apron and holding a loaf of freshly baked bread. And this is my first image of Mary. And my mother put a candle up there. So she lit it whenever we kids were sick. When we were traveling, she also lit it when we had exams. And I have to say, I got a lot of good grades because of that candle. And it just was an enormous comfort to me. That's why we light candles. We light them for comfort. We light them to relax. We light them on our meditation altars as we're about to meditate to get us to focus our attention. My mother also lit them during storms. And then candles also have deep religious meaning. People all over the world light candles from all kinds of religious traditions. You find them in Buddhist shrine rooms. The Jewish people celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, a festival of lights, and light candles every night for 8 nights. They won't begin Shabbat without lighting candles. And Indian peoples celebrate the festival of Diwali, another festival of lights. And it's not only the Hindu people from India, but Jains and Sikhs as well. So candles are important to all of us.
Easter, for example, we have that beautiful hymn called the Exultet. And I know one of the things that I love about it is you start with just the single candle, and then people have little tapers, little candles that they light from the main central, it's called a Paschal candle. And the light fills this dark room. And there's a line in the Exultet that says it's a light divided but undimmed. I love that because it means, sometimes we think you give something away, it's less for me. But in fact, in the world of love, you give it away and it multiplies and nothing's dim.
Yeah. And, that great Indian poet, Khalil Gibran, said something very similar to the line from the Exultet. He said that a candle loses nothing of its light when lighting another candle. And what a metaphor that is for our lives. As you say, Dave, you don't diminish your love by giving it away. The love only increases. So that's part of the mystery of candles. I also love an old Chinese proverb. It's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And that's what we're doing when we light a candle. We're not cursing the darkness. We're helping to dispel it by bringing in the light. And you can read more about this on my website, tessabalecki.com. Now, February is not only the month of the Feast of the Presentation, the Feast of Candlemas, Valentine's Day, speaking about love, it's also Black History Month. And Dave, you have some very powerful posts on Sand and Sky about the great civil rights activist John Lewis, who wrote his kind of biography or his story of the civil rights movement as a graphic novel. What sparked your interest in him and inspired you to read that? It's called March.
Yes, there's a trilogy. It's called March. It's a graphic novel. And I think what first hit me was we were actually sitting in our car at the farmer's market in Tucson
I remember that.
when we
It
were
was his
listening.
funeral.
Yes, it was John Lewis's funeral. So that's was the impetus, I would say, then it drove me to read March. I heard about it. It was a review I think I'd heard on the radio. And then I also heard an interview with the artist who did, the writer who worked with John Lewis. He had been working in Lewis's office. His name is Andrew Iden. And Lewis himself actually really wanted to do this comic book because apparently there was a book about Martin Luther King that came out, a comic in the time of King. And Lewis thought, we need to keep that alive.
Well, had you ever read a graphic novel before?
The only one I had read before was actually about Israel and Palestine. It's called Waltzing with Bashir, which is very powerful. And what struck me about this, and what I think is difficult to convey with just words, was that you had these images of these famous people I'd heard about all my life, but I never had any sense of how did they relate to one another? What was going on behind the scenes, behind the headlines? And there's a very intimate portrait of Lewis with Dr. King, with Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, and how these different people and organizations related to one another. And you see how tenuous the civil rights movement was. I think sometimes we have this idea that once something's happened, we say, it had to happen. Well, it barely happened. And the resistance was just unbelievable.
Were there any particular scenes that really stood out for you as you were reading that graphic novel?
Well, of course, I suppose one of the most powerful is the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on what they called Bloody Sunday, because you watch these people crossing this bridge in the presence of tremendous hatred and the images of people being beaten. Lewis was almost beaten to death that day. I think that's a really powerful scene. The other, I'd say, a more lighthearted scene, which was really wonderful, was these guys were always getting thrown in jail. And one time they're sitting there thinking, are we ever going to get out of here? And all of a sudden the cops walk in with Harry Belafonte. And Belafonte bails them out because it turns out that great Jamaican-American singer was also a very powerful force in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I remember a powerful thing he did on Martin Luther King, which we need to come back to in another podcast. How about surprises? Did you learn something that you had no idea about before you read the novel?
Well, I think part of the surprise was just the difficulty of getting everybody to work together. For one thing, we had Congress of Racial Equality, you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you had all these different groups, and how do we get us to work together? And I thought that was really fascinating. The other thing that really surprised me was a speech that Lyndon Johnson gave, President Johnson gave when the voting rights bill came up. On this issue, he really seemed to have come through. And this speech is so beautiful and so articulate and so sensitive to what was going on in the Black community. And I think it really had an impact on the Southern United States and on the Southern politicians.
And people can see some of that in your post.
Yes.
On sandandsky.org. Do you think your life is very different? You're a privileged white guy
Yes.
compared to what John Lewis faced in his life. Do you see commonalities between you? Is there a common thread between you?
Well, one of the things that really struck me when I learned more about his life was that he had a backpack when he was crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge. And what was in the backpack? He had some fruit, and then he had a book called The Seven-Story Mountain by a man named Thomas Merton, who became a Cistercian monk. in the 40s or
Yeah.
50s.
Merton.
Yeah.
John Lewis is carrying Merton across the Pettus Bridge.
Yeah. So that's the common ground, because when I was in college at Prescott College, my roommate, who's the last person in the world who would ever recommend such a book, said, you should read this book. And I was so shocked. I didn't know monks existed in the 20th century. I didn't know anything about the contemplative tradition in Christianity. And so all of a sudden, I was beginning to be initiated into a tradition that brought me here today, and here I am. But so we had both been touched by that kind of contemplative spirituality. And I think there's two aspects to it. And this was very prominent in Merton. One is the sacramental aspect, which means the world is good, the world is beautiful, and we need this quiet times of prayer and meditation and reflection. True. And the world has some problems. And the prophets are there to remind us that there are some things we need to resist and changes we need to make. Prophets do tend to end up in the jail occasionally. And John Lewis was very philosophical about this. And he just said, well, when you see injustice being done, you just have to take the chance and get into some good trouble. And he was always encouraging people to practice good trouble. And I think Lewis took that tack from Merton, both of which are valid and both of which are important in our world.
Yeah, and I think your own life embodies both of those dimensions so well. And I think just even the content of this podcast mirrors exactly what you're saying, because we have these contemplative, mystical aspects of the practice of going for a walk, the practice of doing a meditation, the practice of devotion to Our Lady, lighting candles, and then the other side, the engaged contemplation in action.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, lastly, what would you say was Lewis's greatest virtue?
I think it was forgiveness.
Ah,
He, toward the end of his life, he mentioned that a guy walked into his office in Washington one day. He said, Mr. Lewis, Congressman Lewis, I met you 40 years ago. I beat you up and threw you in jail. I am sorry.
whoa!
He comes in there. He's 70 years old. He's in there with a 40-year-old son, and the three of them just threw their arms around each other and wept.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we might have this idea that forgiveness is something that weak people do, and you let people take advantage of you. You say, well, that's okay. It doesn't bother me. Well, you'll notice he kept standing up and resisting injustice. He didn't just roll over and say, oh, that's okay. You can be nasty to me. But when someone opened the door to forgiveness, boom, he was ready. And to me, that's powerful. And I saw an interview clip from Bishop Desmond Tutu recently. I think he was with the Dalai Lama. And somebody said, yeah, well, forgiveness, that's just too easy, isn't it? I mean, you just say, oh, okay, I forgive you. And Tutu just laughs and says, well, if you say that, it's obvious you never tried it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this is not for weaklings.
No.
Forgiveness is hard work. And we know a thing or two about that, which we'll be talking about somewhere down the line. Thank you, Dave. I hope all of you listeners will not only take to heart Dave's enthusiasm for the greatness of a man like John Lewis, but look at those posts. Also, look at what he has, what he wrote for Martin Luther King Day last month. All of this an important part of remembering Black History Month and why we have such a commemoration as a Black History Month. Our spiritual practice for this month, we've already talked a bit about. is the lighting of candles and why they're so important. And our meditation for this podcast is going to be a candle blessing. And what do we mean by blessing? It's kind of official in our own tradition, but it's really a very natural thing. So, in preparation for you're doing this in your own home, we're going to go through a meditation with you. But if you go to my website, tessabalecki.com, and read my Candlemas meditation, you'll see you can get a hard copy of this meditation and use it in your own home with your own family, with your friends. Using water to bless candles is one way to do it. Incensing them, sprinkling them with flower petals, just holding them in a reverential position is a way of blessing them. And we're going to do several prayers and meditations with you now. They come from Karl Rahner, from our friend Tom Renaud, who was also a monk in our community and has given us permission to use his poetry and his music in our work. And most importantly, the biggest part of this meditation, where we talk about different kinds of candles, why we light them, and the effect of lighting different kinds of candles for different intentions. That comes from the great Black theologian Howard Thurman.
So as we begin, we remind ourselves it's good to find a comfortable position, usually with your back straight and good posture, if possible. And take a few deep breaths so that the body can relax. And you can set aside any worries, any anxieties you may have in the day. And let us begin.
Light the candles. They have more right to exist than all the darkness.
Candles of joy despite all sadness.
Candles of hope, where despair keeps watch.
Candles of courage for fears ever present.
Candles of peace for tempest-tossed days.
Candles of grace to ease heavy burdens.
Candles of love to inspire all our living.
Candles to burn the year long.
Candles to burn the year long. Maker of the universe, source of all light, spirit of all that is, bless our candles. May we who use them to bring light out of darkness come with joy to the light that shines forever.
May these candles light our way through the dark until the dawn comes and the morning star rises in our hearts.
A reflection from the prophet Isaiah.
The people that walked in darkness has seen a great light. On those who live in a land of deep shadow, a light has shone. You have made their gladness greater. You have made their joy increase. They rejoice in your presence as they rejoice at harvest time.
Rise up in splendor. Your light has come. No more shall the sun be your light by day, nor the moon enlighten you by night. The Lord God shall be your everlasting light, and you shall be radiant at what you see.
I have seen the morning star upon the distant horizon. All the shadows of the dark cannot keep the sun from rising.
I have seen the morning star upon the distant horizon. All the shadows of the dark cannot keep the sun from rising. Thank you for listening.
And if you like what you've heard, please visit sandandsky.org and press the donate button. And you can sign up for our free monthly newsletters. Mine's called Desert Tracks and Tessa is Seasons.
At sandandsky.org or tessabalecki.com. On our next podcast, it'll be the season of Lent. Don't be too dismayed by that. Lent is an old English word that means spring. And so the podcast will also be about the spring equinox. And I'll be talking about Lenten ashes, worms, and the compost pile in relation to our contemplative life, of course.
And I'll be talking about our experiences in the Holy Land.
Till next time, this is Fire and Light.
Conversations on life, love, and soul.
The background music for Fire and Light is The Day We Met, composed and performed by Ricky Zhao.
Fire and Light's theme music is Dreamcatcher, composed and performed by Chris Martin and Jeff Harvey at Purple Planet Music.
Fire and Light is recorded in Tucson, Arizona, editing by David Levin.